Okay, so my name is Devin Hoover, and I wanted to do a top 10 list like Mr. Draper, but I couldn't really decide on what my top 10 would be, so I decided to just do 10 of something. And so that became 10 underrated monarchs that you probably never heard of, but are actually really fascinating in their own right. Okay, so just a brief disclaimer, basically saying that okay, I picked these, so I'm kind of biased, and you may not agree, and you may have other options, but screw you, I'm the one presenting. So yeah, okay. So let's just get this over with, because everyone knows I like the Ottomans a lot, and so I gotta put an Ottoman monarch up, and this is the only one, I promise. So this guy's name is Abdülmecid I, who basically presided over an era of modernization within the Ottoman Empire. So he was the guy who a series of laws was passed that collectively was known as the Tanzimat Reforms, and actually Tanzimat is Turkish for reform, so technically it was called the Reform. And basically, this modernized the Ottoman Empire to make it a more European state. So we're talking universal education, universal education, the implementation of a postal system, and universal law code, abolishing, I think, serfdom. And this was implemented for a long time throughout his reign. And unlike any other ruler that I previously read about, this guy actually toured the empire to see how these reforms are being implemented. So he actually took a great deal of interest in his actual people. And at the time, the Ottoman Empire was still very diverse, as I think it still had holdings in the Balkans and in Egypt and North Africa, as well as the Levant and what was then Palestine. In addition, he opened the gates to the palace every Friday to hear the public's complaints. And every Friday, there would be a long line, and he would patiently listen to each person address their complaints. So in addition, in the 1800s, there was a famine in Ireland, the Great Famine, potato famine, and this was the first major use or event in which people pledged to send aid. In other words, this was the first one of the first humanitarian efforts in the world. That was ugly. So Queen Victoria had offered to send, I believe, 2,000 pounds to the Irish to actually help them. And at the time, Ireland was controlled by the United Kingdom, and it was rude to send anything higher than that, because that would feel like the Irish would be more attached to any other country. Well, this guy pledged to send 10,000 pounds to Ireland, much higher than the 2,000 pound amount sent by Queen Victoria. So the British diplomats were like, dude, you can't send more than 2,000 pounds. You gotta shorten it. So he's like, fine. So he shortens it down to 1,000 pounds. Oh. And when the British diplomats got back home, they were totally roasted in the press for making this guy shorten it. And so even though he had sent 1,000 pounds, he secretly sent several ships past all the British ships with supplies and food. And in gratitude, some of the counties in modern Ireland actually have crescents on their emblems to recognize this guy's help. And some of the Irish people that were saved from the Great Famine voluntarily fought for the service of the Sultan in the Crimean War. And finally, somehow I read on the internet that technically Samuel Morse got his first patent for the telegraph from the Ottoman Empire, not the United States, and it was granted to him after Abdülmecid personally tested the machine. And I guess that got a seal of approval. Oh, by the way, when does this period end?
Sometime.
1206, because I'm looking at the clock.
You should
Okay.
probably.
Yeah. So the next monarch I have is William IV of Great Britain. So most historians usually just glimpse over this guy because it's between the Georgian era and the Victorian era. But this guy's really fascinating in his own right. So unlike any of his brothers, who were all sons of George III, he went into the Navy, and he was nicknamed the Sailor King due to his service in the Navy. And he had actually fought with the British in the American Revolution, and it went even so far as George Washington tried to kidnap him for a ransom, but that plot never really materialized. But he was later promoted to Lord High Admiral, and he was so willing to fight for his country in the Napoleonic Wars that he almost tried to leave, but the rest of the royal family convinced him not to go, and this would kind of be a constant theme throughout the rest of the British monarchy, even though he's so eager. So then when George III dies, his brother George IV becomes king, and George IV is a bit of a scandalous person. He has numerous affairs. He basically decorates his palace to be really lavish. He becomes really fat and ugly, and basically everyone hates him. And he carries on this routine for 10 years until he dies, much to everyone's relief. So then William, as the next oldest, next in line, he becomes king in 1830, and he made sure his coronation cost a tenth of his brother's. He wanted to be nothing like his brother. And he was a really popular king, according to the sources that I've read. He was known for giving people rides in his carriage if they actually needed to go somewhere. I said that. And not just people, ordinary people. And in addition, his reign saw several reforms. So I believe he abolished slavery throughout the British Empire. Previously, they just abolished slavery in just Britain. But now that slavery is abolished across the empire, that really made a statement to all these other European countries to abolish slavery as well. So I think he restricted child labor, and the brilliant Reform Act of 1832 was passed, which basically gave the public more say in politics. And it could be argued that the passage of this one act prevented a revolution in Britain, whereas the rest of Europe had a lot of revolutions. Okay, so the next guy I think I talked about once, his name is Pedro II. So most people aren't actually familiar with the fact that Brazil actually had a monarchy once it declared independence from Portugal. But when he was born, Brazil was in a state of real bad turmoil. So his father had abdicated in order to mediate a succession crisis back in Portugal. And that was honestly the only way that he could actually save his home country. And his mother died when he was really young. So he never actually really knew his parents. So he got to grow up with a lot of teachers and nurses. And as a result, he started reading and reading and reading. And so by the time he ascends the throne at, I believe, age 15, okay, it doesn't actually say, he mastered like 12 languages. He knew like everything in science. He was able to communicate with the latest European contemporaries on arts and stuff. So he actually communicated with people like Darwin and Pasteur and Wagner, I believe. And those giants in their fields back in Europe all respected him. And so as a result, I think he's one of 3 non-French people to be elected to the French Academy of Sciences, the other being Napoleon and Peter the Great. So like Abdul-Majid, he personally tested the telephone when it came out. He was in Philadelphia when that happened, and his presence was a shock to everyone, as everyone wanted to rush to see this really amazing man. And so he was one of the first admirers of Alexander Graham Bell, and I think he gave the telephone a patent in Brazil. Okay, so Brazil was also the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, but I should probably talk a little bit about Brazilian slavery, because it's not like American slavery at all. So I believe slaves in Brazil had Sunday off. They are allowed to form their own occupations. So for example, slaves are actually able to form bands, and that was like a very common practice. And some of them were actually really good. They performed in front of him sometimes. And so he would travel abroad a lot and communicate with European leaders. And he also raised very talented kids. He had a daughter named Isabella, who actually was later barred from taking the throne after he abdicated. But Isabella was a very effective regent in his absence, and so she passed a law of free birth that abolished slavery. And if you would think about this sudden depletion in the labor force, you'd think that there would be like harvest failures all across Brazil. But miraculously, no. The year after slavery was abolished, it was one of the most plentiful harvests in the entire history of Brazil. And so when the Paraguayan War broke out, this is when Paraguay invaded its neighbors, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. Pedro II insisted on going out to the front himself, despite having no military experience and leading the troops, because he needed to be there. So he never insisted in calling himself a general or an emperor. He just gave the name. He gave the name for himself, first volunteer. So modest, and he would actually use his language-speaking abilities to talk with POWs, leaders from other countries, in effective negotiations. And this is why he became the ruler of the 10th largest empire ever. And so when the Paraguayan War was over, there was a lot of loot to be looted. And so instead of actually using those funds to build an equestrian statue of himself, like most other monarchs would do, he donated the funds to found a school, the Pedro II school, and that was like, it's like a magnet school in Brazil now, I think. Okay, so I'm not going to pronounce his entire name, but the next guy is called Rama V from Siam. So his father probably would be better known if you've actually seen The King and I, because that's the king that they're referring to. Died in 1868 from malaria. So there was a solar eclipse that happened in Malaysia, which was then a British colony. And so his father had knowledge in astronomy, and he actually calculated where the sun and the moon would be in the sky and where would be the best place to observe the eclipse. And the French astronomers in Europe mocked him. They believed that, this is a bit of racism going on, but his father actually proved them wrong. He was more accurate, and he actually saw the eclipse, unlike the European astronomers. But it was during the expedition that he and his son, which is him, both caught malaria, but the son survived, luckily. So once Rama V became king, he immediately toured all the nearby British colonies. So we're talking Calcutta in India and Singapore, and he noticed how the British were able to administer. And he really admired the British, and for good reason, as they were like the largest empire in the world ever. And so he went back to Thailand, or Siam, I guess it would be called, to actually implement these reforms. So he made the Royal Military Academy in 1887 to sort of train troops in a more Western fashion. He adopted Western clothing. That's pretty Western for like a king. And he was also the first Siamese king to send princes to Europe to be educated, and also the first king to actually go to Europe. So a little bit of a backstory. The French had taken Vietnam, or as was then known, Indochina from China, and they were planning to invade Siam as well. So there was this brief war in which the French totally kicked Siam's butt because of superior technology. But the French demanded that they give up several ports, I believe, and cede what was now Laos to them. And I think they refused because that would be completely ridiculous. And so this guy did something that no one in Europe actually anticipated. He marched all the way down to Europe, and he's like, guys, we're going to negotiate. I'm not just some other power that you're just going to play around with. And that is the reason Thailand was actually never conquered by any foreign power, because of this guy's effective leadership. And he also abolished slavery and a system called corvée, which I think is like forced unpaid labor. And he created a system of equitable land distribution. And I think he was leaning towards socialism then. Okay, so the next monarch is Aurelian. It's the first ancient one from the Romans. So you probably would have heard of good Roman emperors like Diocletian or Augustus or maybe Constantine. But this guy gets vanished from the record books, probably because he only had a 5-year reign. But when he became emperor of Rome in 270, it wasn't really the Roman Empire anymore. It was actually 3 empires. So you had your Roman Empire, or what was left of the Roman Empire. Then the western part had ceded and became the Gallic Empire, while as the eastern part had ceded as well and became the Palmyrene Empire. This was in the middle of a large ongoing crisis called the Crisis of the 3rd Century, in which Rome somehow miraculously was able to pull back and effectively resume, basically, being awesome. So Aurelian, in the span of only 5 years, was able to reunify the Roman Empire by conquering both empires, and he led an effective triumph down Rome when he did so. Unfortunately, I think he was assassinated after. But probably one of his most lasting legacies that no one actually realizes is that he kind of threw aside the old pagan Roman mythology, and he introduced a new religion, what is called the cult of Sol Invictus, or the unconquered sun, in which they believed in one faith, one empire. So seeing this in the light of Christianity, this is actually really interesting because it wasn't just because this really helps, this is like foreshadows the development of Christianity throughout the empire. And the cult of Sol Invictus is actually one of the main reasons that Christmas is celebrated in December, although we have decisive evidence that Jesus was born in spring, or something like that. Okay, so the next guy, if you guys have watched Extra History, you may have heard this guy, Khosrow the First from the Sassanids. So the Sassanids are a dynasty in Persia. Okay, I'm assuming you watch Extra History, so you probably know what this is. Okay, so before Khosrow was born, Persia was kind of in a bit of turmoil as well, as there was they were kind of in squabbles with the Hephalites, which are sort of tribes to the east that they sort of invaded and were conducting raids. And so his father, I believe, effectively ended the Hephalite reign of terror. And so now that Khosrow I could actually implement reforms and sort of focus on internal developments. So he created the fourth social class, the Daegons. So previously it was like the nobility, the clergy, and then everyone else. But by elevating the fourth social class, he elevated these small landowning citizens, and which were actually considered lower nobility, and so this increased the amount of social mobility, so people could actually get rich now. And so now that Daegons were considered nobility, they could actually join the army, as only the nobility were allowed to join the army. And so now that the army is actually really buff, you could actually invade stuff. So he invaded multiple times. He invaded the Byzantine Empire, and he had a lot of border squabbles with the Emperor Justinian. So when Justinian closed the School of Athens, which is like this very famous philosophical school, Khosrow was able to accept these Byzantine refugees because he saw the meaning of these scholars. And so he founded his own school, which he called the Academy of Gondishapur. And perhaps his most lasting legacy is that during his reign, he imported chess and backgammon for training military. So it's hard to see that simple games now were actually seen as like education in those days, but they are actually really effective strategic games. And so, yeah, if it wasn't from this guy, he probably would have been playing chess and backgammon now. So yeah. Okay, so this is probably the only evil monarch that I have from Rana Valona I from Madagascar. Okay, so she was probably the first ruler to actually unify Madagascar, as probably most people don't know that Madagascar is really ethnically diverse. So it was really hard to do this before. So she maintained strict order by a trial of ordeal, or tenega. So basically, if you were innocent or guilty, basically they would feed you this poisonous fruit. And if it killed you, you were guilty, and if not, you were innocent. Although this was clearly rigged in the nobility's favor, so like if you were a member of the nobility, they'd probably leak out some of the poison and then give it to some wild animals. And so this would make the effects of the poison more mild. So it doesn't really actually kill you. Yeah. And she made sure that the British and French did not try to take over internal affairs of the island. She was especially suspicious of Christian missionaries, as she sort of viewed them as sort of the troublemakers. So what she did was, let me think. She would make these officials hold these missionaries on vines above this like 150-foot cliff, and the officials would ask the missionaries to renounce their religion, and if they said no, the vines would be cut, they fall to their death. Yeah.
Effective.
So she created a forced labor system called Whanapuana, which I'm really bad at pronouncing terms. And she was able to create a large standing army, and like I said before, she used that large standing army to conquer the island. And thanks to her, Britain and France would never sort of get a hold until Madagascar until a lot later. Okay, and so this guy is named as Menander I, and he's the king, most famous king of the Indo-Greek kingdom. So a little bit of background: after Alexander the Great conquered Persia, he founded several cities on the very easternmost edge, and those cities became hard to administer when the Seleucid Empire basically took over what was then Persia. And so these cities sort of seceded and formed the kingdoms of Greco-Bactria and the Indo-Greeks. So this is like in the Indus River, so this is where Pakistan and India would be now. So he consulted the Buddhist sage Nagasena, and this is like chronicled in some very important Buddhist document, I'm sure. And he basically asked about what Buddhism is, what the rituals are, what the benefits are, and he became convinced that Buddhism was actually very interesting. So he converted from Greek paganism to Buddhism, and so he inspired a lot of his other subjects to convert, as India was just right on his doorstep. So we actually don't really know a lot about the nature of his rule, but most people can probably agree he's a benevolent ruler. He's really good. And if it wasn't for him, the Buddhism wouldn't have developed into its modern form. So the Greeks were able to contribute their amazing philosophy into basically what is now called Mahayana Buddhism. And it is alleged that the first statue of the Buddha was actually made by the Greeks. So previously, the Buddha would be represented in symbolic form, like the Bodhi tree. And so, yeah. So Greeks contributed a lot to Buddhism, which nobody really is. And I think this is the last guy. Frederick III from Germany. So Frederick was born in what was then Prussia, which is like the ancestor to modern Germany. And as a Prussian prince, he learned a lot of subjects that every Prussian prince would. English. So he learned English and French. He loved learning languages. So he studied history, geography, physics, music, and religion. And then on his free time, he actually practiced riding and gymnastics. Just sort of weird for a guy to do gymnastics, but he was actually really good, or so I hear. So at age 18, if you were a Prussian prince, what you traditionally do is begin a military career and study in a military institute. But at age 18, he actually broke with family tradition, and he enrolled at the University of Bonn. So he received a liberal education, and so he was able to communicate with a lot of philosophers, and also, he communicated with a lot of people, from philosophers to geologists even, and this liberal education would greatly impact him later. So he was arranged to be married, but to the daughter of Queen Victoria, Princess Victoria. Those are different. So even though the marriage was actually arranged, this could not be a more perfect match, as Princess Victoria had the same liberal education that she had. Princess Victoria spoke multiple languages, and there's evidence that they really loved each other, which is really nice. So although he hated war, Prussia would be expanding a lot. So first against Denmark in the Second Schleswig War, then against Austria in the Austro-Prussian War, then against France in the Franco-Prussian War. So Frederick would see command in all of those. So he fought in the famous Battle of Königgrätz, which basically turned the tide for Prussia against Austria, and the Battle of Sedan, which turned the tide for Prussia against France. And he received a lot of positive praise for great leadership. And if it wasn't for him, the battles could have been indecisive, or it could have turned against the enemy, or the enemy could have won. So in the 1880s, we see a rising trend of anti-Semitism in Germany, and this sort of foreshadows World War II a little bit. But he and his wife are really disgusted by this, so he decided to attend a synagogue service. And the couple effectively spoke out against the rising anti-Semitism. And he even lost respect from his own sons because he went to these synagogue services. And despite this, he actually continued to go. And he continued to support a lot of Jewish individuals in Berlin, which is really nice. So he was the son of the Kaiser Wilhelm, the first Kaiser of modern Germany, if you know anything about German history. So when the Kaiser died, and of course, Wilhelm and Frederick actually had a lot of differences, but when the Kaiser died, he became the new king, but unfortunately, he was a very heavy smoker throughout his entire life. And just prior to taking the throne, he was diagnosed with cancer to the larynx, so sad, and then he only lasted 3 months in his reign, and it was actually a very spectacular reign. But then Kaiser Wilhelm II his son became Kaiser, and then World War I. Yeah, that's it.
Any questions? No questions. Zero questions.